So this is the last recap we're going to have. Um, this is what we've covered so far. We've talked about historical views of the mind. I gave you some theoretical background and some understanding of how cognitive science developed. Then we talked about cognitive architectures for a while. Then we talked about aspects of cognition, including consciousness, rationality, perception, concepts, and some illusions there that might reveal that how we think about cognition isn't quite how it works. We did a section on biology, and we just wrapped up the section on embodiment and emotions. So now we're going to talk about ethics. And there's going to be two related talks. So there's going to be the lecture today on moral psychology. And then after this, there's going to be a lecture on neuroethics. Basically how we make moral judgments and reasoning. So I'll introduce moral psychology first, and the concept of moral dumbfounding next, which you'll see. And then try to wrap it all up with a metaphor. So I think a lot of the stuff that we've discussed in this class is going to start coming up fast and furious in these lectures, right? So our seemingly irrational behavior, some inferences about evolutionary explanations for that, even ancient understandings of how the mind works, not even ancients, modernists as well. Buddhism is going to come up again. Embodied cognition, the body being relevant, and emotions are all going to be relevant to all of this. Okay, so when we start off this question about morality, one fundamental question here is what is human nature? Are we naturally selfish? Do we strive for some deep truth, justice? Or are we just a bunch of like bags of emotions, bags of like intuitions, bags of instincts that interact in, perhaps conflicting ways? There's advocates historically of all of these views, and I think that those are all gonna, maybe you've covered these in other classes. We talked about rationalists, and the intuitionists that we'll discuss today are going to be in the line of David Hume, who we also discussed, as well as Charles Darwin and others. So in the rationalist view, there might be passions, there might be emotional responses to moral situations, but they're not relevant in our moral decisions. So you encounter an evil actor, perhaps, a villain tying somebody up to railroad tracks, twirling his mustache. And you judge that is bad because of your fundamental moral sense. And then you make a moral judgment. On the intuitionist view, the emotion comes first, and in fact is a precondition to our moral judgments. David Hume in this passage makes the comparison to a person desiring the end of the world. It's a rational decision to desire the end of the world. It's a rational decision to get up. It's a rational decision to go to school. Like, all of these are rational decisions depending on your goals. If your goals are different, then your rationality changes. And so he thinks that ultimately some of the drivers of our goals are going to be the embodied emotional centers of our mind. So here's the situation. A man goes into a supermarket, buys chicken. Before he consumes the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he thoroughly cooks it and enjoys it. You probably had an emotional response to this. But if you think about it, like, you're in college, so you probably check that emotional response and then try to answer this question. Or if you were not in college, if you were just having your normal reaction where you're not being forced to consider these things, you just be like, no, no, why the hell do I have to tell you why it's wrong? It's wrong. So that's the setup. I'm going to introduce the phenomenon that just occurred via, first we're going to talk about people, and then we're going to give some proponents. Okay. So it was weird that Penn students had that response, and probably some of you that listen to this had some a response as well, where you began to genuinely consider why it was weird after that initial reaction. And some psychologists have pointed out that that's a potential problem with psychology in general. Most of psychology is done via research on college students, but college students are a peculiar population. They are largely Western, educated from mostly industrialized backgrounds, richer than the average in the world, and from usually developed countries. These factors mean that they tend to understand moral judgments very differently. Weird people are more individualistic, whereas in non-weird societies, non-weird populations, there tends to be more sociocentric. It's more about your community. In weird societies, people assume independence, whereas in more sociocentric societies, they assume interdependence. Weird people will, when I say, who are you? You would describe certain features, certain traits that you have, rather than certain relations that you have. And you tend to be more analytic rather than holistic, which means that a lot of the focus on from these populations is on harm and fairness, rather than community or divinity or other things. So I'm going to talk about a study that took place about 27 years ago in Philadelphia, near Penn, where Jonathan Haidt, this researcher, was based, and in 2 different areas in Brazil. Those stars are supposed to represent those areas, but you know what? Don't even worry about it. It's in Brazil. The study divided up the population into high and low economic groups, and then children and adults. That means that there were some 12 conditions, and they took 360 subjects, which means roughly about 30 per condition. That is high SES children, low SES adults in Brazil or the United States, right? So here are the prompts. A girl wants to use a swing, so she pushes a boy off and hurts him. A boy wears regular clothes to school, even though the school requires students to wear a uniform. A man eats all of his food with his hands in public and in private after washing them. Okay? These are these initial ones are meant to sort of give a baseline, then they start getting weirder. A woman is cleaning out her closet and she finds her old American flag. She doesn't want the flag anymore, so she cuts it up into pieces and uses the rags to clean her bathroom. A woman was dying, and on her deathbed, she asked her son to promise that he would visit her grave every week. The son loved his mother very much, so he promised to visit her grave every week. But after the mother died, the son didn't keep his promise because he was very, very busy. I'm sorry I put that image there. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. A man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys chicken, but before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he thoroughly cooks and eats it. That's the prompt that we talked about earlier. So the first ones were some mild violations or some conventional violations, moral violations. And then there was societal violations and intergroup violations. These are, I guess, violations of sanctity, of maybe some disgust violations. A brother and sister like to kiss each other on the mouth. When no one is around, they find a secret hiding place and kiss each other on the mouth passionately. A 12-year-old boy eats so much candy that he is full, but he still wants to eat more candy, so he makes himself throw up in the bathroom. Then he returns to his room to eat more candy. Nobody sees him do this, and it does not make him feel bad. Yeah, they asked some participants whether they would sell their soul in a contract much like this. And roughly, then we get the results. So as you'll see in this situation, in Brazil, it seemed like most things were judged as violations from low socioeconomic status, or at least in one part of Brazil, Recife. In high socioeconomic situations, they tended to judge things still bad, but less bad in that particular area. You'll see that, sorry. The first was adults. So adults viewed the swing violation as a violation in most places. That's the pushing case. The majority of adults viewed the violation of conventional. That's low socioeconomic students. The majority of them viewed that as offensive. Harmless offensive, so offensive but non-moral harms were viewed as offensive in low socioeconomic areas in Recife, and except for the promise to the dying relative in Porto Alegre, and similarly in Philadelphia. But only the incest taboo received majority condemnation by every group of adults. And in the high socioeconomic areas, nobody in Philadelphia, nobody thought it was bad to use a flag to clean bathrooms. Children tended to view most things as more violations in most places. Right. Then they asked a set of questions about how universal the judgment is. The idea being that moral judgments, the way we think about them in the West, are ones that we generalize to populations that we've never even met. In a lot of these cases, so the moral violations of the pushing somebody to get on the swings, the majority of people across all conditions viewed that as universal. Whereas the not eating with your hands was about half the people in the low SES condition in one of the places did. Low socioeconomic status, people tended to view harmless, offensive cases as universally bad, whereas higher socioeconomic status, people only tended to view perhaps maybe actually none of these were universal except for the chicken case for Porto Alegre. Children by and large, universalized their judgment way more than adults did. Which means that, children tended to have more severe judgments across all conditions. And I guess only in the uniform case was it less than half for children across all, or at least across most conditions. This sort of leads to Haidt's view of what he calls moral dumbfounding. It seemed like in harm cases, people would give reasons for their judgments, and they would describe their judgments based on reasons. They would keep to their arguments. Whereas in the harmless taboo stories, the reasons didn't seem to matter. They would give the judgment first and then come to reasons. And when they were asked to analyze them, they found it difficult to keep up all of the reasons, right? So the brother and sister, you have to say, they enjoy it. They live the rest of their lives and have a good time. Nobody finds out about it. You ask for their reasons why it's bad and then change the scenario each time. And people will still say it's wrong and but will give up their reasoning for it. They'll just say it's wrong. There's a gut feeling. So there's also another study where they asked them to think of complex things, and it turned out that you would increase your more dumbfounding. You wouldn't be able to give good reasons, but you wouldn't necessarily change the severity of your judgments, which is fascinating. So let's try to understand this. But to do that, I'll have to wait until the next video.